my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby imports and distributors, and welcome to part 4. With the destruction of a large part of the Japanese carrier force at Midway, it will be the turn of the US and its allies to go on the offensive in the Pacific. Starting in August 1942 with the invasion of the island of Guadalcanal by the United States Marines. Formed in 1798 from the Continental Marines, the US Marine Corps provided manpower on battleships and cruisers, plus landing parties and manning guns, very similar to the United Kingdom's Royal Marines. In World War I, they became part of the American Expeditionary Force under General Pershing and distinguished themselves in the Battle of Belleau Woods. It's here where they may have got their nickname from the Germans, Teufelhunden, the Devil Dogs. In the 1930s or late 1930s, far-seeing USMC officers started to experiment with amphibious warfare and found a civilian amphibious tractor in Florida called the Alligator or the Amtrak, later to be called the LVT, Landing Vehicle Tract, and a landing craft by a powerboat company called the Higgins Boat, ideal for getting personnel straight onto the beach. The Japanese naval force was still a formidable foe, and it was the US Naval Force's intention to draw the Japanese into an attritional war in and around the Solomon Islands. Back in late 1920s, Australian pilot Charles Kingford Smith flew a Fokker triplane, Southern Cross, which Tiger Hobbies do a model of, from the United States to Australia via Hawaii and Fiji. This flight would be the pioneer of the routes used by military transport and bomber aircraft during the Pacific War. It would also be the same route via sea, known as the MSR, the main supply route to Australia, which was actually critical for the Allies' effort in the area. The Japanese were pushing to cut this route, thus slow down the supplies getting to Australia. The first major amphibious landings of the war were carried out by the United States Marines on August 7, 1942, on the islands of Tulagi and Florida, which were taken after fierce fighting, but the main landings on Guadalcanal were met with minor resistance and put the US Marines onto the beaches, meeting little incoming fire. The US Marines made their way inland and captured what would become Henderson Field. The Japanese, though, quickly reinforced the island and started to try to retake the airfield. This led to some bitter fighting throughout August and September 1942. In August 42, just days after the US Marines had landed, the Japanese tried to strike at the US transports and warships off Guadalcanal around Savo Island. This led to the worst defeat of the US Navy in World War II, when over 1,000 US Navy crewmen were killed, along with 4 heavy cruisers and many other ships badly damaged. This forced the US transports to move away from the Guadalcanal before they could unload their supplies to the Marines, leaving the US Marines in a terrible position and the Japanese in control of the seas in the area. Constantly lacking supplies and ammo, the US Marines, and later joined by the United States Army, fought fanatical battles with the Japanese, including the most famous action by Marine Sergeant John Basilone. I'm showing behind me a short clip from the HBO Pacific TV series to show the ferocity of Basilone's action on the 24th of October 1942. Basilone with US Marines defending Henderson Airfield against potentially 3,000 Japanese, manned a heavy machine gunner and M1917 for several days with no rest, no sleep whatsoever, burning himself because they didn't have the asbestos gloves, and killed untold Japanese and winning the Medal of Honor. Further naval battles will be fought around this area, including the Battle of Santa Cruz, where the US Navy would lose the carrier CV-8 USS Hornet, and the Japanese lost many aircraft and many aircrew it could ill afford to lose. By February 1943, the Allies were in control of Guadalcanal and the seas around it. But it came at massive cost. 15,000 casualties, 29 major Allied warships sunk, and over 600 Allied aircraft lost. But the Japanese lost just as many, and in a war of attrition, we're now back in the United States, shipyards, aircraft factories and tank factories pumping out equipment. Japan were doomed. After securing the Solomons and surrounding seas, US forces would split the Pacific into two separate fronts. First, the South Pacific under General MacArthur, commanding land forces, and Admiral Halsey pushing north through the Solomons. The Central Pacific, that we are concentrating on, will be mainly a US naval and marine offensive led by Admiral Chester Nimitz. It's in the Central Pacific we will concentrate. There is a number of disagreements in which way the campaign should be fought, arguing among senior Allied officers. But one thing they did agree was not to waste lives on heavily defended islands, but rather than pass them by, cut them off, hit them with air power, and stop any resupply, as what MacArthur called let them wither on the vine. It'll also be known as the Island Hopping Campaign. The first major offensive in the Central Pacific would be the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, starting in late 1943. By this time, the US Navy had built its new carrier force with the new Essex-class carrier. These were about 30,000 tons with all the lessons learnt from previous carriers. It was much longer, had a wider flight deck than previous Yorktown class, and had some 90 aircraft, what the US Navy would refer to as the Sunday Punch selection: 36 fighters, Hellcats, 36 dive bombers, still the dear old Dauntless, and 18 torpedo bombers, the TBM Avenger. The Essex were backed by the new light carriers of the Independence class and escort carriers, sometimes called Jeep carriers, whose job it was to supply the fleet with attritional replacements of the three main types of aircraft: fighters, bombers and torpedo aircraft. Some of these early types are now at last started to be replaced. As I mentioned earlier on, the Wildcat replaced by the F6F Hellcat, the Terrible Devastator by the TBM Avenger. But the dear old Dauntless would have to carry well into 1944, as the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver was still not ready and suffering many problems, production problems. There are also many lessons learned from the Coral Sea and Midway, and the disaster early in the Guadalcanal campaign when the Japanese defeated the US and the Navy had to get rid of their transports from the landing beaches, leaving the Marines vulnerable. This time the landings would be backed up by massive force and screened by large numbers of cruisers and destroyers and battleships to pound the defending Japanese. There would be a complete system of transports and LSTs to quickly get the US Marines onto the beaches. I'm also showing behind me a clip from the 1956 movie Away All Boats, again starring our old friend, the actor Jeff Chandler, from our last video about the Red Ball Express. This time he's a captain of an APA, Auxiliary Personnel Attack Ship. Each one of these ships, based on the larger Victory cargo ship, would carry a battalion of Marines and also their landing craft, both the landing craft vehicle and personnel and the larger LCM landing craft mechanised landing crafts. Almost 250 of these massive ships will be built for the US Navy and used in the Pacific and the European theatre, but were critical to the Pacific campaign. In this, he explains the complex way you organise a landing craft before loading them with troops. It's a very much a mundane task, like anything to do with logistics, but it's absolutely critical to get the US Marines on the beach as quickly as possible. In November 1943, the largest amphibious operation so far in the Pacific War took place on the Gilbert Islands, on the atoll of Tarawa, consisting of 17 carriers, 6 fleet, 5 light and 6 escorts, plus 12 battleships, 12 heavy cruisers, 66 destroyers, 36 transports carrying 35,000 Marines and US Army personnel. The Americans were taking no chance against the 5,000 Japanese defenders on the main island of Bito, I think, or Bito, I think it's called, who were equipped with about 40 large guns. The US forces were confident that the overwhelming force would overcome the Japanese defenders, and the US Navy battleships poured onto the Japanese some 3,000 shells for about 4 hours prior to the landings, thinking that nothing, I repeat, nothing could survive under such a pounding, especially on such a small island. First assault went in about 0900, but the low tides made it impossible for the Higgins boats to come close to the beach. So the LVTs, which were tracked vehicles, managed to get themselves over the coral. But these were the early versions of the LVT with little armour, and the Japanese who survived the naval bombardment started to destroy these LVTs. and caused many casualties amongst the assaulting Marines. Many Marines were stuck behind a log wall near the beach and were pinned down by intense Japanese fire. Larger LCM, landing craft, mechanised landing craft, with tanks, I think Stuart and Sherman tanks, dumped their ramps straight onto the coral, and these large tanks drove straight onto the coral. Some foundered, but many managed to get across the coral, across the shallows, and give the Marines the supporting fire they needed. Tarawa was the toughest opposed landing in the Pacific so far, and it took almost 4 days of intense fighting to finally defeat the Japanese. Over half the LVTs were destroyed, along with many landing craft, and some 4,000 US casualties, including US Navy personnel killed by Japanese counterfire. The Japanese, of 5,000, 4,700 were killed. This was a taste of things to come. A number of bitter lessons were learned by the US Navy forces. The US naval bombardment was not enough. 30,000 shells, well, might need to be 30,000 shells. Also knowledge of tides and underwater obstacles, and the formation of what we call UDT, the UDT, Underwater Demolition Teams, forerunner of today's United States Navy SEALs, to destroy natural underwater obstacles and find the state of the tides and the beach for armour. Assault craft needed to be better, especially the LVT needed more armour, and a specialist LVT called the LVTA Assault. This is armed with a short 75mm gun that could provide fire support from the shallows like some crocodile. War correspondent Robert Sharrod wrote, "Last week, some 2,000 or 3,000 United States Marines, most of them now dead and wounded, gave the nation a name to stand beside those of Concord Bridge, Bonhomme Richards, the Alamo, Little Bighorn and Belleau Woods. Tarawa, bloody Tarawa." In early 1944, with even larger forces, the US attacked the Marshall Islands, including Kwajalein. They put into practice all the lessons learnt from Tarawa, including the use of specialist UDT teams and massive naval bombardment, improved landing craft and LVTs. There are also a large presence of US Army there as well, and it's the US Army's partition in the battles of the Central Pacific is often overlooked, and in fact the US Navy, US Marines and US Army fought very well together. In the end, the Marshall Islands were taken with far fewer casualties than the Gilberts, and the Japanese suffered another 7,000 to 8,000 dead. In part 5, we shall look at the tougher battles for the Marianas, almost breaking into Japan's backyard, and the slaughter of Japanese naval air power at the Battle of the Philippine Seas, or better known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.